Hey folks, what's going on? Hope all is well. Back at it with another recap in the 2026 Fide Candidates Tournament for the Open and Women's sections. And in this one, we're in round 5. So not quite at the halfway point. There are 14 rounds, but they're getting there, and there have been clear separation really in the Open section. And in the Women's, they're starting to clarify things. And in that Open section, we had Sindarov coming out of the rest day on 3.5 out of 4 and Fabi trailing him on 2.5 out of 4, and it was really a question of who would really separate. In this one, Sindarov was playing a Akara Nakamura who had been on 1.5 out of 4 going into this game, so on -1, and he really needed to try and turn the tides of the tournament for himself, especially playing the leader. This position we have in front of us is a critical one where Akaru is white in a very, very sharp Marshall Gambit. It's a line that comes out of the triangle defense. I'm not going to get into that opening setup, but essentially in this position, white is 2 pawns down. You see that on the king side there are 2 pawns missing where black has pawns. But what does he have for those 2 pawns? Well, white has the 2 bishops. The bishop pair is an asset. He potentially has an open file for his rook, a half open file later in the game. And he's really trying to play with initiative, trying to get something complicated, some attack going, while black's pieces are kind of bad. There are a few temporarily bad pieces. This diagonal a6, not really that great, kind of dominated by the bishop for the time being. And this bishop on c8 really lacks scope. Both diagonals it can go toward are not really very open. And so really it's this temporary moment of time where white has to try and do something fast. And unfortunately here for Hikaru, he played a really serious mistake with this move h4. Now, it does make sense to hit the queen, but the thing is you really want to try to centralize and manufacture more pressure in the center as well as hitting the queen. And it actually turns out that the best move here is knight e4. Now, miraculously, it was revealed in the press conference that Hikaru did not have anything in his files for black's very natural reaction. Sindarov's last move was actually castles here, and while it's not the first line of the engine, it's actually the second. So it's a huge miss that Hikaru did not have prep in this area, and it does happen from time to time, but you just kind of hoping it doesn't happen at the worst possible time, which is probably in a really, really high stakes event like the candidates. So what is the idea with knight e4? Well, the idea is you hit this queen with tempo. The queen would have to go to a5 with check to try and get some time back. And after b4, knight takes b4, castles. You actually have a position that winds up being similar to the game. But the point is the knight is on e4, which is far more active than where it is on g3. And the next few moves, rook e8 is really not quite forced, but it is a move to defend this knight, get out the pin. You have queen d2 hitting this knight. Black might play a move like c5, and then surprisingly, after bishop takes e7, rook takes e7, and rook a d1, there's actually serious pressure on black's king because there is a back rank issue here, so queen d8 check is a threat in some positions, and a move like bishop d7, which looks really natural to defend the back rank threat, actually fails to the miraculous knight f6 check. And I could spend an hour here talking about all those intricacies, but we're going to leave it at that. It's just a really complicated line where, there's basically some computer variations where if you know them, you have chances. If you don't, you don't. So unfortunately for Hikaru, he was not aware of those details, and he played the move, if we go back here, h4. And the difference is after h4, queen a5 check, b4, which was played, knight takes b4 castles. If you had to choose, you'd much rather have the knight e4 on the board than h4. And unfortunately, this knight really never made its impact in the game. And, we basically had a very similar line. Rook e8 happened defending the knight like I showed you in the other line. Queen d2, c5, rook a d1. And here, again, if the pawn was on h4, it was not on h4, this knight on e4, very different story. But here, knight f5, which was played, is actually excellent and forces off another minor piece, which is really good when you're already up, 2 pawns and any trades kind of work for you. So essentially, Hikaru kind of missed the mark with the preparation. There were some trades. There was one last moment. King h2 is actually slightly more precise than king h1, but there was one last moment here where Sindarov had to defend effectively. You could say, well, knight takes f3 might be a move, trying to trade more pieces. It actually runs into rook takes g7 check, and very complicated line where after rook takes g7, king takes g7, rook g1 check is miraculously a draw, because if you go king f6, queen h6 is checkmate. And if you take that rook, well, there's a repetition with queen g5 check, bishop's covering f8, king h8, queen f6, and we do this shuffle here. But Sindarov saw that off. He had an hour on the clock here because g6 was played. And after a few more trades, the position just fizzled out, and black got a completely winning opposite colored bishop ending, which 3 pawns up was enough to win, and Sindarov did so. Really tough break for Hikaru, honestly. He definitely was looking to really make a move in this tournament, and now that he's out, lost this game, he's officially 3 points behind Sindarov. Sindarov is 4.5 out of 5. Hikaru's 1.5. Really kind of a massive, massive uphill battle, and I almost want to say Hikaru would be kind of out of it now as in terms of the running for first place, but you really can't say that definitively because there are 14 games left. So collapses happened, but typically, if the trend holds, it'll be very, very hard for Hikaru to make up a 3-point ground. All right, so that brings us to Fabiano Caruana, who, going to the rest day, he did lose to Sindarov, and so he was a point behind and chasing him, and he's playing blue bomb, and he really needed to win. And this is really the critical position of the game in my view. White has played e4, and blue bomb responded with the Petrov as he has done, and it's a mostly symmetrical structure. You see there's a four pawns here, on the queen side, and in the center there are 4 pawns here. There's a 3-on-3 going on here. But Fabiano made the position a little bit dynamic by castling queenside. And so there's real pressure on the black king side here with these pawn advances. And typically when you're being attacked and there's a lot of pressure being put on you, you actually want to trade pieces. And so, and that's maybe not that might be the most obvious thing ever. Yeah, you want to trade when you're under pressure, but it's also about making the right exchanges. And in this position, it is actually black to move after Fabi's bishop d3. And blue bomb has a choice. And this bishop is being hit by, or the bishop is hitting the knight on e4. This bishop on d2 is available for that knight. And you kind of have to decide, well, which bishop do I want? Do I want to allow bishop takes e4 in some circumstance, or do I want to take this bishop on d2? Dark square bishop or light square bishop? If I look at my king right now, I see that, these dark squares are going to probably be under pressure pretty quickly because the pawns are actually on light. And so usually when one side has pawns, you want the bishop to complement those pawns. So if there's a light squared pawns everywhere, I'm going to want the dark squared bishop. Conversely, if this pawn was back on f4 and that pawn was on g5 and we had that type of complex, I would prefer the light squared bishop. And so because of that, the best move is knight takes d2. And the point is, after knight takes d2, rook takes d2, again, the pawn and the bishop aren't complementing each other too great. And you also have a string of pieces on this dark square diagonal, which could be a factor at some point. Like, surely not now. Wasting a move like bishop h6 is absurd. But unsurprisingly to me, queen h4 is actually a move in this position, and it's based upon the dark square dynamic. That's kind of where black has the foothold because the dark square bishops come off the board. So really, that should have been played, knight takes d2, and instead blue bomb played the natural but really bad rook e8. And the point is, it makes sense to get the rook on the e-file, but essentially this gives white the opportunity to exchange and get the right bishop. And so Fabi very quickly played bishop takes c4, and after rook takes e4, h4, you have the right bishop to kind of undermine the complex on the king side. And it really was a position that really never got going for blue bomb. He just didn't get enough counterplay. So we can look at a few more moves were played. There's a little bit of a mess here. Both sides were in time trouble. And long story short, after c4, this queen was hit. It can't. There's no time to play rook takes a2. If queen b6 was played, which was not played, threatening mate, there's the very, very subtle bishop c1, just defending the mate in two different ways, and threatening the very unsubtle knight takes d5 or rook takes d5, and the position's just collapsing because black's queen side pieces, the rook on a8, bishop on c8, never really get in the game. So that would have been the way to play. But anyway, c4, queen a6, knight takes d5. And the only reason I'm showing you more moves here is because even though it's completely winning for white, there was a really nice tactic here at the end with knight takes f6 check, bishop takes f6, queen e8 check, king g7, and Blue Bomb very graciously allowed h6 mate. So not every day you see checkmate on the board. I think this was really kind of a little bit of cynicism on Blue Bomb's part to allow the checkmate, because he entered the post-game press conference and was beside himself. He was really distraught. He answered all the questions really kind of meekly and despondently, and yeah, that's just where we are. So Blue Bomb gets his first loss. Fabiano gets a very important win, and he is now still a point behind Sindarov with 9 rounds to go. All right, next game was between Prague and Esipenko. It was kind of a relatively uninteresting game. I expected Prague to actually do more with the white pieces here, but this is probably the one of the critical positions of the game, where essentially white has some good things going for him. You have the rooks on c1 and d1. The bishops are lined towards the black king, and there's even potential for maybe a queen to pop out towards the king side. And there's a knight on e5 that's pretty menacing. So because of those things, it does seem like white might have some play. And it's a question of how you kind of do that. So I'll show you what Prague did first and why it kind of missed the mark a little bit. So Prague played the move f4. And what he does is he anchors this knight on e5, which is an incredible piece. What, unfortunately, the drawback of this move is it weakens the e4 square and the g4 square. And whenever you push a pawn, you weaken the squares adjacent to it. So if you push g3, you'd weaken f3 and h3. If you push b4, you weaken a4 and c4. And that's just the reality of it. And if you push a pawn 2 squares, like if g4 was played here, it wasn't, but then you weaken 4 squares because you weaken the squares adjacent, and you weaken the ones the pawn could no longer cover. So that's the dynamic when you push pawns. And these weaknesses do potentially allow some knight e4, knight g4, bishop g4, some jumps in the future. So after f4, Esipenko played queen e7. And then queen f3 happened, and you can see Prague already trying to cover these weak squares. But it was pretty clear he didn't have a great plan to go forward. And Esipenko could just build. He wound up doubling his rooks on the c-file. There was kind of a standoff here, but nothing really happened, in part because pushing now is really hard given the weakness on e4. And there actually was a repetition in this position here. So if we go back now to the position right before f4, I'm going to suggest, I mean, maybe not totally original, because is in this position, not totally original because I got a computer here. But there are two moves that are a little bit more incisive and just don't create those holes here. One is queen h4, and this is actually my favorite. And the point is you have the bishop and queen lined up on h7, so now the knight really has to pay special care. And you also have the bishop on b2 still staring down the diagonal as well. And so with those combinations, you could imagine maybe at some point d takes c5 being a strong move, sort of lifting the knight from e5 to open up the diagonal for the bishop, and some checkmate happening on h7. I don't know why Prague didn't go for queen h4. It's very natural to me. I'm thinking maybe there was a concern about bishop takes e5, but no, that can't be, because the knight needs to cover e4, so it needs to cover h7, so that doesn't work. So I'm trying to figure out what the deal was. I mean, maybe after h6 there was not. It was unclear how to keep the position going. You know, there are ways. One way is actually g4, and In some positions, g5 will be a threat. Sometimes you can actually open up the g file and attack there. Play king h1, rook g1, a la Hikaru in his game against Sindarov, but in a much better way. And it's funny because you might say, oh my god, g4 is, creating some weaknesses. But the key thing is it's not creating weaknesses in the center, and these pawns, the f and e pawns, are still covering important squares. So that would have been the way to go. And it's funny because Queen h4, g4 was a move I was mentioning. G4 here as well is actually a decent idea. Again, trying to shift the knight from f6 and maybe get some play like that. So very surprised in this kind of ho-hum draw where nothing really happened at the end. And I think Prague really wasted a valuable opportunity with the white game. But many rounds ago, he's on 50%. He just has to start winning sooner rather than later. All right, last game in the open section was a game between Anish Giri and Wei Yi. And I'm actually picking it up basically in the opening because there is something pretty unusual for me. I hadn't seen this before. We have a pretty standard Catalan position here. The main feature is this long light squared bishop on the diagonal. And really, typically, black's job is to try to neutralize that bishop on g2. So most often here, this position has been played thousands of times, you see the move bishop c6, so that if this knight ever moves, the bishop on c6 can trade for the one on g2, and there isn't that same pressure. But instead here, Wei Yi came packing with a novelty, and he played the move c5, which is a move that initially the engine, kind of looks at it like it's really weird, and then it continues to drop as you make more moves. And it was something that, is very, very remarkable to me because it seems like the last move that you'd be trying to play here. Now, again, the pawn is hanging. There are two attackers here, and there's only one defender. And so Giri naturally played d takes c5. And after bishop c6, you don't even try to get the pawn back. And so the point was, what is the idea? And the idea, as it seems to me, is that after knight c3 and then a5, very important move stopping b4, that eventually the pawn on c5 is actually surrounded, and black has achieved the c5 break that is kind of the standard break on the black side of Catalans anyway. He's achieved it really early, and now just has to hunt that pawn down. And so in the game, Anish played knight e5, but what I want to do is actually just ask the question, what happens if white tries to hold on to that pawn for as long as possible? Because this is what I was wondering during the game. So this is just a sample line to kind of show you how difficult it actually is, because it turns out to be pretty hard. So let's say bishop e3, overprotecting the pawn, knight bd7, putting more pressure on it. Two attackers, two defenders, nothing to worry about yet. Rook fd1, pinning the queen, so still the pawn is covered. Rook c8, potentially putting more pressure on the pawn. Rook c1, also maybe doing something to protect the pawn. h6, very useful move, creating an escape square. h3, queen e8, getting out of the way of the pin. And then let's say king h2, this is just a passing move. And then here's the real tactical idea, is that you can actually play the move b6. And the point is that if c takes b6, the rook is lined up against the queen on c4, so bishop takes f3 tactically just works out, and black is doing fine here. If you don't take the b6 pawn, black will just recapture the pawn and recover the material on the next move. So basically, this is one of the main ideas. Another thing that's actually possible is not even playing b6 right away and starting with knight takes c5. And again, it seems like there's two defenders and two attackers, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is that after bishop takes c5, there's this tactic bishop takes f3, again taking advantage of the pin of the queen on c4. And so to make a long story short, or a short story long, this pawn on c5 is just, you just can't hold on to it in a really reasonable way, and it's for that reason that this idea is good and black has very legitimate compensation. So Anish didn't even try. He gave the pawn back pretty quickly. And you got a very symmetrical position that, unfortunately is just not enough to really get real winning chances at this level. I mean, essentially b6 happened, and in this position, Anish could take on c5, and you could say, well, there's split pawns here. Isn't there a little bit of something for white in this type of ending? And the answer is just no. Like, the b pawn is backward. The b pawn is just as much as a target as the c pawn, and it's just not happening. And so, we had a ton more moves, more trades, but it really was just window dressing for a rook endgame that would ultimately be drawn. And that's basically what happened. So they agreed to draw here right after the time control. And yeah, it was an interesting game from a theoretical perspective, but from an entertainment perspective, not so much. So Anish is still on 50%. He's there with Prague. And one of those two players, Prague or Anish, has got to assert themselves that they're, kind of chasing the pack of, Sindarov and Fabi, who are really running away with this so far. All right, on to the women's section. So going into the rest day, we had, I think, two players on essentially +1. One was Katarina Lakno on 2.5 out of 4, or I think was it 2 out of 4? And one was, I'm getting this wrong. I know Lakno was on 2 out of 4 going into the rest day because she had such an up and down event. Bibi Sara was in the lead, actually. She had +2 on 2.5 out of 4. And coincidentally, Lakno and Bibi Sara were actually playing each other. And so, huge matchup. And this position is really complicated. White is up in exchange. They have a rook here for knight. And it's, and the pawns are equal. So, very messy position. But, kings on opposite sides of the board. But it's really imperative that Bibi Sara really presses Lakno on the clock to justify, or on the board to justify the material advantage that white has. And in this position, Bibi Sara has a huge opportunity, and it's really weird because the knight is attacked, so you think, oh, maybe I just move it back, play knight c6. This is what she played, but it's actually losing because white gets to play knight c5, and then just start trading pieces. And essentially after knight f4, knight takes c6 happened. There were more trades, and there just wasn't enough here. This bishop on g7 is locked behind the pawn e5, and, just an exchange up. The knight is on c6 as well, has no jumping squares towards the center. It's just too much for black to handle here. Instead, and this is a big instead, in this position after c3, there's this incredible sequence that begins with knight takes c3. And I'm a little surprised that Bibi Sara didn't play this because she does love a mess. She loves tactics. She loves a sharp position. But I also get it. You're basically under 10 minutes, have almost 20 moves to go to make the time control because they're on move 23. It's tough to go for this. But the point is that after knight takes c3, b takes c3, you play bishop takes b3. And you've taken a pawn, but you traded a piece, but you've taken a pawn, and you've exposed the king even further, and you're hitting the rook. And you might say, well, what about this knight is hanging? Well, that is forced. You basically have to take that knight. And the point is now you actually have this incredible move, bishop c2 check. And if you go anywhere on the dark squares, like king b2 or king a1, then e4 is devastating. The bishop and the queen line up here on this diagonal, and checkmate is going to be incoming. So you have to actually give up your queen. And after king b2, after bishop c2, queen takes c2, rook takes c2, king takes c2, it looks like white has more than enough material. White has a rook, 2 rooks, and a bishop for the queen. That is way too many points. I mean, if the rooks are 5, that's 10. Bishop is 3-ish, that's 13. More than enough for the queen, except for the fact that it's black to move and black's attacking. And now this bishop on g7 that's been dormant comes to life with this move e4. And again, this king on c2 has very little shelter, and queen c3 is a check, queen b2. Well, queen b2 is actually a checkmating threat, right? Like h5, queen b2 is mate. And bishop d4 runs into queen c6 check, and it's just a mess. It's a mess. White is fine, but black has their fun. So that was really the huge opportunity to actually sacrifice on c3, try to open up the bishop with e4, it was not played. And in the final position, this bishop on g7 that really never got into the game actually is still stuck at on g7, blocked by the e5 pawn, and that's how the game finished. So Logno got a huge win, got to 3 out of 5. This is remarkable given that, again, she's actually had some very tough positions in this tournament and is now on 3 out of 5, on +1, with all to play for. Bibisar, a huge setback with black, but I am sure she will recover. All right, next game was with Zhu Jinner, who honestly has been the most impressively prepared player in this tournament. If I could say, Logno has had a lot of tough positions that she's kind of bounced back from. Zhu Jinner has had a lot of really amazing positions that she hasn't won enough of. But she did get a win going to the rest day to be 2 out of 4. And in this one, she was trying to keep that going. So she's white here and is clearly better, and more than better, she's winning. You see the eval bar, but it's not so easy how to win. White is a pawn up and has a ton of space based upon these queenside pawns here and the pawn on e5, but you gotta finish the game, and it feels like black is building a fortress. There are no pawn breaks anymore that make much sense, and it seems very hard to get in. There's no invasion squares on black's side of the board for white's heavy pieces, except for the move queen h6, which after queen h6, there's no other squares to really get in. If queen h6 happens, actually, queen g8 can be played. And again, there are no squares for the white queen to get in on. But Zhu Jinner really managed her time well, thought here, was patient, and found a very, very impressive maneuver that I think is really instructive for every chess player, because sometimes to go forward, you gotta go back first. And that's why here queen g3 was played, and it is an excellent move. It actually deserves at least 1 exclamation point. And the point is, what she's trying to do after king d8, queen e1, is she's trying to double on the c file and invade on c8. Now, this forces black to shift their defensive position, because now the queen has to kind of try to cover the business squares in the c file. And she started with queen e7 just to kind of keep an eye on h4. And Zhu Jinner said, that's fine, I'll just defend that with my king h3. And after queen e8 went queen c1, saying, you can have my b5 pawn, rook c8 is going to menace you. And after queen d7, queen c2, rook e7, now queen b3. Very, very annoying. The point is that if you do nothing, rook c6 is an idea, but I also am just being really patient, keeping an eye on d5, making it very hard to keep your posture. So rook e6 happened, queen b4, a few more quiet maneuvering moves happened, and then finally Zhu got what she wanted, which was both pieces doubled on the c file, ready to infiltrate. And after a few more moves, this is what happened. The pieces essentially got in the front door, the front of the house. This rook is super active, this queen is passive, d5 is weak, and you just can't do anything about it. Rook e7 was played, the white rook juked it, went to c6, and then actually the g6 is loose, and after a few more moves, rook takes g6, Vaishali resigned. Really impressive win for Zhu. She basically maneuvered really well. She had a huge advantage in the opening, as she's had in basically every position, and now she's won 2 in a row and is starting to impose her will as the highest rated player on her side of the field. And yeah, I think she really is in a great spot to really assert herself and maybe get some distance as we move forward in this candidates. All right, next game was between Alexander Grechkina and Anna Muzichuk. A really interesting position arose where black is the 2 bishops, but, white actually is a little better. And the reason is white has decent pieces, and really it's about this knight on e7, to be honest. This knight on e7 isn't very good. It has no jumping squares going forward. It's a little awkward there. It could potentially come under pressure by the rook later. And, white needs to keep developing. So Goretzka here should play the move bishop f4, which is a tempo gaining move, hitting that rook on b8. And after something like rook b4, white can go queen d2, connect their rooks, and just have a nice advantage. One thing to point out here is that d takes e4, which looks like it might be doing something, fails to bishop d6. And now the rook is attacked, the knight is pinned, and this is extremely unpleasant. If the rook goes back, something like knight takes e4, these split pawns become a little bit of a liability. And black is not lost yet, but it's just not pretty position at all to deal with. Instead, after d5, unfortunately, Goretzka played e takes d5. And the issue is now after knight takes d5, this knight that was really bad on e7 gets to be, active on a central square, covered by an outpost, or traded. And frankly, after knight takes e5, queen takes d5, and these exchanges, black has the bishop pair, and arguably is already slightly better because the knight on b3 is really a terrible piece. It reminds me of a knight on b6 in the Alekhine. It's actually very rare that a knight on b6 or b3 is good in chess, particularly in like opening and middle game play. So that's actually one to keep in mind. Try to avoid knights on that square. I can think of very few examples where it's actually sensible. But black has a ton of activity. The material's equal, bishop pair, and it basically fizzled out. There was an exchange of the dark square bishops. There's not a real blockade on the Isolani because the knight on b3 is so bad. And after some more exchanges, there was a dead drawn rook ending. Note, by the way, that rook e8 is a nice, cute move. You might say, oh no, my rook. Well, it runs into rook b1 and then checkmate on the next move. So that rook was not captured. This rook came back, and then we had this nice little juking sequence to end the game. So a draw, kind of a ho-hum draw here. Ani Mosuchuk was in the lead, and she still maintains her lead, but it's a shared tie for first place now that Zhu Jinner, I think, joined her. Yeah, she has 3 points, and so does Lucknow now. All right, last but not least, there was a game between Tan Zhongyi and Divya Deshmukh, and Divya lost her last game, and so did Tan, actually. So they're both, coming after a loss, coming out of the rest day. You want to recover and, not risk it in a serious way, but you just want to come and have a good, kind of solid game there. And it seems like white is doing that here. This is a slightly better pawn structure for white because essentially there's one clear pawn island here that makes up the 5 pawns, and black, on the other hand, has 3 different islands. So that should mean that, white is better. But the thing is here is that black's very active. The rooks are doubled on the c-file. This knight on e4 is on a pretty decent outpost. And one of the things I've learned about Carlsbad structures, you can Google that, but I'll tell you that this is a Carlsbad structure from a Queen's Gambit, is that a lot of times the minority attack, which wound up happening here with b4, b5, exchanging on the c-file at some point, leaving this pawn isolated, is that while white is stirring up all this trouble on the queen side and trying to do stuff on these files, black's got to actually drum up play on the king side, and Divya understood this well because she played the move g5. And this is an excellent move that shows excellent understanding of the position. The point is that you're pushing pawns in front of your king to kind of create some weaknesses here. And after rook a8, rook c6, queen b5, g4 just does that. And there's a real kind of trauma that happens to white's pawns on the king side when you play g4, because if you do nothing, and I'll just shuffle to show what nothing looks like. Now black can actually rip open the g file and all of a sudden start to create attacks here. So with like queen g5, maybe the rook comes in, maybe the knight comes in. All of a sudden, all the pieces come to life with just one open file. So you don't want to allow that. But the other issue is that if you take, let's say take. If you take on g4, well, now sometimes black can play on the h file, and then rook h8, queen h4, and there's sometimes checkmate down there. And the last thing that's annoying about this is that if white pushes, and again, I get that the h pawn is hanging here, but just bear with me. Imagine it's not hanging. There's this idea of playing g3. And when you play g3, if you take it, then there's both the e pawn and the h pawn are weak. But if you push, then this pawn is a thorn pawn that basically helps black create a checkmating net on the h file. So really the issue at g5 is, and then g4 is however you deal with that break, there's going to be some real discomfort. And that's the brilliance of it. So after queen b5 in this position and g4 is played, Tan took on g4. But now after takes, it's imperative you trade pieces to not allow some of those ideas I showed. And so rooks came off. There was a check. Knights came off. Queens were about to come off. And in this position, they just made the time control and agreed to a draw here. Because after something like queen takes g5, king takes g5, king f2, there aren't enough pieces to really do much more. Like if you give a check, this king will come to g3. You basically can have a repetition like this. The b pawn would be very dangerous if it was further up the board, but the bishop on f1 is stopping it from moving, and this rook can come to b1 to corral it. And so a draw was a fair result. But knowing the ideas of this kind of minority attack in the Carlsbad for black is an important thing to know, because we always talk about the queenside play for white. Not many people know the kingside play for black. All right, so that was all the games. Again, 4 games in the Open, 4 games in the women's. Well, what's going on right now? The takeaways. Sindarov is killing it, 4.5 out of 5. Fabi is close behind with 3.5 out of 5. And everyone else is chasing. Everyone else is at 50% or worse in the Open section. In the women's side, we have Zujiner, Anna Muzichuk, and Katarina Lochno all on 3 points. And the furthest person behind is actually on 2. So the women's side is actually much more competitive at this very point in time, because even Vaishali, Divya, and Tanjangi, who all have 2 out of 5, are only a point behind the leader. So everyone has a chance still to come out as the winning candidate. So, all right, so I'll leave it there. There is a game tomorrow. That will be round 6, and I'm looking forward to checking out those games. Hope you do too. All right, take care. Peace.